My name is Ben Johnson. I teach in the history department at Loyola University Chicago. I grew up in Houston, Texas. Yeah, I wrote a book that was published in 2003 called Revolution in Texas that looked at the border violence of the 19 teens and its reverberations, particularly the creation of a segregated society along Anglo-Mexican lines in South Texas and the creation of a Mexican-American civil rights movement. And I was involved in conversation with a lot of scholars, including some of the other founders of Refusing to Forget, and our frustration as we approached the 20 teens was that people, academics, had been writing about these events for a very long time, right? Including prominent people like Americo Paredes. And a lot of families, of course, had passed along their own memories of this time of violence and trouble, but it seemed not to have kind of percolated into society in general, into the ways that Texas and American history was being taught in general, or just into the kind of historical consciousness of educated people. And so you would read, newspaper stories in the 20 teens or, in the century of anti-Mexican violence. And it was like the author seemed to have no idea that this was not something new, right? That there was a long history, of these things. I came across, I was reading a kind of now classic book by a historian named David Montejano about Texas history, and I came across discussion of this uprising associated with the Plan of San Diego and of massive violence that it became the pretext for, like hundreds, maybe thousands of people killed. I was in my 20s. I had an undergraduate degree in history. I think I was in my second year of graduate studies. I'm like, wait a minute. Why am I just learning about this now? There are plenty of familial descendants whose grandparents, great uncles, and aunts, etc., had been involved and victimized by these things. But it just was not, I could tell you about Chicago, the Chicago race riot of 1919, right? I could tell you about the New York City draft riots. I knew those things because they were taught to me, starting in middle school. But I didn't know anything about this border violence. And that was the impulse for me writing the dissertation that became the book, Revolution in Texas. The three avenues that seemed the most promising from the beginning were creating a website with reliable, curated, vetted historical information about these events, approaching a museum and doing a museum exhibit, and then applying for historical markers, right? For better or for worse, a lot more people learn about their history via the internet, by going to a museum, or by stopping at a roadside historical marker than necessarily from reading books and articles that people like me write. It's the border violence of the 1910s and anti-Mexican, anti-Latino violence in general are chapters of American history that are very poorly understood by the public as a whole. And that is to our detriment of understanding the world that we live in and the scars that so many people living in this country carry with them. Especially for me to meet the descendants of people who I encountered in historical records, right, who were long since dead. And these people, felt like their stories had been forgotten, or even worse, that their ancestors had been lied about, right, framed as thieves and bandits, when in fact they were just ordinary people going about their business. Generally, it's been gratifying in my professional world to see the number of people teaching U.S. history, teaching Mexican American history, Latino history, Borderlands history, who have used our website and resources in their own classes, being contacted by students in their classes who are writing their assignments based on this, and then being contacted by the press, writing about contemporary border politics and anti-Latino violence, who I think understand, thanks to our efforts and other developments in the last decade, who now understand that there's a long history to this kind of violence, right? That this is not something that just started recently